good company over here, Rachel.
Is it the dormitory in your
I am a bit taller than Bill Shorten. This is the proof. Thank you so much. What a privilege it is for me and for all my ABC colleagues to be here. And can I first thank the Yotta Yindi Foundation for that. And I would like to make a collective thank you, an acknowledgement to the traditional owners of these ceremonial lands. I've been asked to do that on behalf of all the panellists. So let me just say that before we begin. Thank you so much for the great privilege of being here. Now, for anyone who doesn't know it, the Q&A program is actually here on these ceremonial lands tomorrow night. The actual program will be broadcast live from Garma at 9 p.m. Northern Territory time. You can still register at our stall just down there. If you haven't seen it already, there's a big and rather embarrassing picture of me wearing a suit, in makeup. Now you can see what I really look like. Much older, much paler, much pinker. You can write questions for that panel tomorrow night as well. And that's what we're relying on, because Q&A is all about your questions. And in a way, today will be a chance for you to practice, because there'll be 2 microphones floating around in this centre for you to ask questions of this panel, which is a panel of a key group of elected officials, your elected representatives. And it's a chance to discuss with them and to hear them talk about some of the key issues which are coming up and which have been coming up for debate in Garma in the past few days. So, for example, there's obviously a huge debate going on redefining land rights. Twiggy Forrest, I think we can thank for a renewed debate on welfare. And Marcia Langton, I know, was here yesterday and looked into this crowd and said, do not dismiss Twiggy. Do not be cynical about his ideas. Heed his messages. They're hard messages, but they have to be heeded. She said, I think the land rights movement is caught up in the soft bigotry of low expectations. That's her opinion. What does this panel think about issues like that? What do you think about issues like that? Here's your chance to ask some questions. She says, the talk of human rights and reconciliation have proved too weak to tackle poverty and economic exclusion. Again, plenty of questions will arise from that, and I'm sure that some of those questions will arise in the course of this panel. We just heard Bill Shorten, for example, raise the constitutional issue and whether anti-discrimination should actually be built into the Constitution. We've got time to have a debate about that, because it's not for a while that the Parliamentary Committee, chaired by Ken, Nova is on it as well, Deputy Chair I think, will be presenting its recommendation. So it's still okay in a public democracy for us, in a big democracy like this, to have debates around issues like that, come to a consensus decision hopefully, and then get to a referendum. So these are some of the issues we'll be talking about. Let me introduce our panel, and I'll give the brief introductions. The Honourable Alan Tudge, and just everyone indicate who you are as I say this, just in case there's anyone miraculously who doesn't know, is Parliamentary Secretary of the Prime Minister on Indigenous Affairs. He's a Victorian MP for the seat of Aston. The Honourable Shayne Neumann MP is a Shadow Minister for Indigenous Affairs. He's from the Queensland seat of Blair. The Honourable, Senator Rachel Siewert is a Green Senator from WA. The Honourable Ken Wyatt MP is a member for Hasluck, and as I said before, he's the chair of the Parliamentary Committee that's seeking a multi-party consensus on constitutional change. Senator Nova Peris is a Labor Senator for the Northern Territory. I'm sure you all know Nova very well. I've only met her for the first time today, and once again, it's a privilege to have met all of these panellists. And I was told originally they were... Oh, sorry, we also should give apologies to George Brandis. Who have I left out?
Was I? It's okay, mate.
Oh my God.
I'm not here.
It's only because he's been an occasional critic of mine, I left him off the list. The Honourable Warren Snowdon MP. I skipped over you because this list here had some of the women at the bottom, and I decided to bring them forward. So now I go back to the blokiest bloke on the panel. The Honourable Warren Snowdon MP is a member for Lingiari and an old friend and critic of mine. Thank you very much. Please give him a big round of applause. Now then, and a brief apology, Senator George Brandis, the Attorney-General, was going to be here, I believe, or had wanted to be here, but he can't be here. But I'm sure Alan Tudge is very happy to answer any questions on Mr Brandis, Senator Brandis' proposed changes to the Anti-Discrimination Act. What do you reckon, Alan? We could start there, but we won't.
Very happy to, Tony.
We'll start with the constitutional issues, and as I said, there's been a lot of discussion about this, and I'd like to hear first of all from Alan, how quickly could this constitutional referendum be put, and what do you imagine will be in it?
Thanks, Tony. It could be put this term, it could be put next term. The question is, when is it likely to succeed? Because what we don't want to do is put up a constitutional question which fails, and that would be an absolute disaster. And we know that amending the Constitution is very, very difficult. Only 8 out of 44 constitutional referenda have got up, and most of those have been very simple propositions. The last one which succeeded was in 1977 from memory, so it is a very difficult thing to do. You must have at least bipartisan support, you must have a broad consensus across the community, and that's indeed what the process is aimed at achieving, which has been ongoing this year and will continue into next year, headed up by Ken Wyatt and Nova Peris, who are leading that constitutional committee.
Yeah, well, let's start with Ken, since you're chairing that committee. You've actually expressed doubts that it may get up before the end of this term. What do you think? Are you any more optimistic than when you made those comments a short while ago?
Now, the basis on which I made those comments is we've got to remember that we have to have the majority of Australians support the question and the majority of states. And in talking with constitutional lawyers, and particularly George Williams, when the expert panel was convened, the message was very clear. Make sure there is an educative awareness program that happens right across Australia so people understand the question. And George reminded us of the Republican movement. He said, consensus was showing that people wanted Australia to move to a republic. There was a significant groundswell, but when it came to the day with the referendum question, people supporting the republic voted against it because the wording was not to their satisfaction. So we've got to get the wording right, and Australia has to be ready to go. If we push it and lose it, Aboriginal leaders have said to me, don't push it and lose it because it'll unravel the 1967 success. It'll also unravel many other gains that we've made. So I would rather see, and I know the panel is still working through this with our consultation processes, but I think we've got to gauge that, and when the time is right, we go.
I'll just go to Rachel. How important is the multi-party aspect of this?
It's one of the concerns I had with Bill's speech was, and sometimes the Prime Minister does it too, talks about bipartisan support. Well, politics of the day is that we have multi-parties in the Parliament now, and unless we have all the parties engaged, we will not get this up either. So I want us to be talking about multi-party support. The Greens have always supported constitutional recognition. We are very strongly engaged. I'm a member of the Joint Parliamentary Committee, but we need to make sure that all the political parties are engaged, understand the issues and support the wording and constitutional recognition.
Did you have any other concerns about Bill Shorten's speech?
You're in good company over here, Rach, between Ken and I.
One of the concerns I have is that we need to be hearing where do we go from here. A lot of the things that we heard were important things to hear, but we need new initiatives, and we need to make sure that when we talk about consultation, that we actually mean consultation, and the word and the thing there is to listen to what people say and consult everybody, and not just the chosen people that you want to hear from. And that's a very important point. There's a whole range of other things that I'm sure we're going to move into, but that's a really important point.
In fact, I suddenly realised actually that you've all gathered together, you've flocked together, the Labor guys on this side and the non-Labor on this side. But let's go to Nova. I mean, do you hear these concerns and what do you think about them?
About the Constitution?
Yes.
Well, we had a recent trip to the Kimberleys where we had prominent leaders within the respective Kimberley region, and one lady, Professor Anne Polini, she said, you know, she's got her eyes and ears to the ground at a local level, but also she's very astute politically, and she's only just hearing about this. So with regards to can this be successful, we've got a long way to go. And I know in the Indigenous space, it's difficult times for Aboriginal people given the amount of cuts there are, and so they're trying to wake up every day and dealing with day in, day out issues. And I know as an Aboriginal person, you know, we're talking about taxpayers' money, taking this to a huge referendum where all we're doing is making a wrong right and having our people, our history, our culture recognised in something that we all know purely exists, but you've got to convince people. And so in that space, we've got a big job to do to get out there and bring the Australian people with us.
I mean, apart from coming on Q&A tomorrow night, which you are, what's the best way, do you think, to do that? How do you think, from this point on, we should inform the public of what's going on?
Yeah, I think what is doing and what's happening really well is the Recognise movement, being involved and partnering with your AFL and your Cricket Australia and having prolific people who are advocating that this is right and Australia shouldn't even hesitate going to the polls and ticking that box and saying, yes, let's recognise the Australia's, you know, the world's oldest collective race of people. And one of the speeches I quite often give when I talk about this movement is Australia's not losing 200 plus years, you're gaining 40,000 years of history. And, you know, that's something that we should all celebrate, but it's a big job. And again, like you talk about, you know, the Republic movement, which I was a delegate to, and we all thought that this was going to get up, but closer to the date, there's all these scare campaigns, you know, people don't like change, all this sort of stuff. So it's about getting the message right, sticking on message, and we can't do that. You know, Labor says this, the Liberals say that, the Independents say we've got to collectively come together as leaders of this country and know exactly what we're putting to Australian people.
So do you ultimately think the question will have to be very, very simple, or can it be layered and nuanced in the way that Bill Shorten said?
Yeah, I think it needs to be simple, but it's got to be meaningful, and like what Bill said, it's got to be of substance. You know, you can't have something that's tokenistic, and something like when you look at Australia's history, you know, Aboriginal people has suffered systemic, you know, decades upon decades of injustice, and we're not going to just stand there and say yes, you know, like a little tickle fancy mention in the. It's when you talk about the discrimination clause 116A, that's to eradicate, not to eradicate, but to ensure things of the past doesn't occur into the future. So we must have that part.
Let's hear Shayne Neumann on that, because I suspect you might have had a role in the speech that was made today, of advising the leader, obviously. What do you think that, to a degree, Bill Shorten is throwing a cat among the pigeons here, raising that aspect so prominently in his speech, the anti-discrimination aspect of the referendum?
I think what Bill's done is listen to what Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people have been talking about. They say that fundamental to constitutional recognition is a prohibition against racial discrimination. The expert panel heard that with 250 consultations around the country, and certainly that's been the evidence that we have received in the Joint Select Committee, whether it's in Brisbane or Kimberley or wherever, and we'll be travelling around the countryside to listen to what Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people want, their dreams, their hopes, their aspirations for constitutional change. Because in the 1890s, a bunch of white blokes got together to form the Constitution and then petitioned a government in the UK to do it, and passed a piece of legislation through the UK Parliament. We want Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people to have a voice, to have their say, and to actually tell us what they want. And I believe strongly that they want a prohibition against racial discrimination, and that's the evidence that's come in so far.
Okay, now I'm going to come to Warren on this. Don't worry about Warren.
Don't worry about it.
I'm not going to cut you out of this panel, I promise you. Just before I do that, I can ask questions till the cows come home. There are 2 microphones floating around, and when you put your hand up, those microphones will go to you. There's a questioner over there. Just before we go to your question, I'll hear from Warren on this.
Look, I think in fact, the whole panel, I think, are heading in the same way, and I suspect Alan would be agreeing that we need to have a document which is agreed across the Parliament. I also believe that the right-minded people within the Parliament believe that we've got to be listening to Aboriginal people in the way in which Shayne described. And if we can't do that, then this is a pointless exercise to me. So we've got to make sure that whatever we put forward, whatever is ever agreed in the end, is something which actually Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people want, not something that other people want on their behalf.
And I'll just get Alan to respond to this. We didn't talk when I initially came to you about Bill Shorten's speech and his emphasis on this anti-discrimination aspect. Is this something that we will see multi-party consensus on?
That will be looked at, and I agree with Warren Snowdon's point that, of course, it's a pointless exercise if the Aboriginal population don't support the question which is put up. While that's essential, we also need to bring along the constitutional conservatives to the cause as well, because they alone could probably put a stop to any referenda. Now,
who are they, by the way?
There's some very well-meaning constitutional conservatives, and their argument is, well, the Constitution should be blind in relation to specifying anybody.
Yeah.
Now,
but you're talking in ignorance here. Are they within your own cabinet? You're talking about within the broader party?
Someone like Greg Craven, who's a very well-known constitutional academic. He's the Vice Chancellor of the Australian Catholic University, based out in Melbourne. So we've got to ensure that those people who can have influence on the broader conservative movement are also comfortable with the question put up. Now, with an anti-discrimination clause, one of the arguments which they will put up against that is that if you put that in the Constitution, then you might find that every single bill which goes through the Parliament ends up in the High Court, and that will then concern many people. So they're the difficult balances which have to be looked at and have to be carefully trodden through over the months ahead by the committee, which Ken and Nova are heading up, and then ultimately by the government and the Parliament.
Well, I'll just go to Ken on that. Is it a little bit like tiptoeing through the minefield here? I mean, do you have a strong position on this aspect that was underlined today by the Labor leader?
Well, let me say, there's a couple of things. One is, Alan's right in terms of potential unintended consequences, and we've got to look at that. The whole issue of racial vilification has never been fully addressed by governments. We have the Racial Discrimination Act, but that doesn't prevent the type of social media commentary that is being circulated. Even as late as yesterday, Nigel Scullion made the comment about David Wirrapunda, sharing with him quite an atrocious comment about him being an Aboriginal person. The Constitution will certainly, if it has racial discrimination in it, address an element of it. What we have to change is the mindset of Australians that Aboriginal people and any other cultural group that individuals wish to vilify is not warranted, because we all have the same capability, capacity, and we all contribute to an Australian society. My own position in terms of discrimination, I'd like to see that there is no discrimination, but I know that's not a reality. I grew up in a period in the 50s and 60s in which some of the most atrocious terms were used to describe me and my family, and that was part of our journey. It was unacceptable. It was much more overt. It's become covert. And we will never stop people who see any race that they don't like from discriminating, but governments should step up to the mark and ensure that legislation they put into place protects Australians. And certainly in terms of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people, there should be a very strong positioning of selling a message very similar to what I've heard over the last day here, that we are no different to any other Australian. So therefore, on that basis, the colour of our skin should not be a factor for which people denigrate or vilify us for. And so on that basis, I support a position, but we also have the challenge of winning over fellow Australians on this debate, and we also have to look at the technical and legal implications of whatever it is that we bring forward.
So, in fact, you'd like to see it in the Constitution? Is that what you're saying?
I'd like to see a set of words in there that protect against discrimination. 116A may not be the form of words. It may be something else, and that's what we've got to explore as a committee with fellow Australians and certainly with Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander communities. And so there's much more debate yet to be had. We all hold personal positions on the panel, and certainly our discussions have been open and frank. but we still have to meet that obligation of winning over fellow Australians. And let me say, it's not going to be easy on some issues.